I think it is clear to leap the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Howard Husick. I'm Vice President for Policy Research here at the Manhattan Institute. Now you're embarrassing me. And welcome to our event tonight on immigration reform, immigration policy. You know, there are few contemporary issues in American life which arouse the depth of engagement and emotion as does our policy toward immigration. That should not be surprising. We are, in point of fact, in an era of immigration, just as measured as a percentage of the population which is foreign-born, unrivaled except by that of the turn of the 20th century, when the first waves of non-English-speaking immigrants in many ways transformed the nation. The number of foreign-born residents in the United States has quadrupled since 1970, doubled since 1990. What's more, we are experiencing as well a wave of non-legal newcomers, not contemplated by even our most recent reforms in 1986. As it has been since the mid-19th century, new immigration has raised questions about economic and cultural impact. Does it help or hurt the economy as a whole? Does it help or hurt specific groups in the population? Should newcomers be encouraged to assimilate and to adapt, and to what extent? The complexity of such questions is matched only by their immediacy. The effects of immigration policy, after all, are far from invisible, as attested not only by a walk through any borough of New York, but also through cities around the country which have not traditionally been immigration hubs, but are today. So it is that immigration policy has moved front and center in American political life and public discussion, but without resolution. A bipartisan effort during the Bush administration, led by Senators John McCain and the late Edward Kennedy, failed to break the logjam. It was an effort to play a role in mapping the details of compromise that our main speakers here tonight sought to assemble a group tasked with developing a blueprint for immigration reform. Noah Pickus and Peter Skerry, the co-leaders of the project and our lead speakers tonight, brought together an array of groups and types, economists and political scientists, liberal and conservative think tanks, and even more unusually, longtime public officials with experience in border enforcement and the citizenship process. Full disclosure, it included me and longtime Manhattan Institute fellow Steve Thernstrom, immigration scholar as well. The goal of their immigration policy roundtable was the development of a policy that could both be politically acceptable and practically implemented. And tonight we're going to put their findings to a test with you. After more than a year, the group, with some defections, produced a proposal. That's what they're going to present. As we as a nation again approach the question of comprehensive immigration reform, so-called, sparked in no small part by what's going on in Arizona and elsewhere, we at the Institute thought that presentation and discussion of this proposal was a timely way to frame the current debate. So think of the evening as a test of the proposal, which sees itself as a guide to the sort of compromise that Congress may soon approach. Will it stand up to scrutiny, both from our respondents and from you in the audience? Or are there aspects of this proposal which should not, in your view, be considered elements of a true compromise? How similar is it to that which is likely to emerge in the Congress, where New York Senator Charles Schumer is expected to be a lead player? Our format will be this. Professors Pickus and Skerry will begin by presenting the key elements of the Immigration Roundtable's proposal. Following that, I will moderate a discussion amongst our designated respondents first, and then do the same involving you in the audience. I'll do introductions for the entire group first, so the program can proceed seamlessly. Beginning with Peter Skerry. Peter Skerry is a a professor of political science at Boston College. And he is I'm sorry, I've just misplaced my notes. Here they are. He's the author of a great deal of scholarship on immigration, most notably the book Mexican Americans, the Ambivalent Minority. His current project is a study of the social, cultural, and political integration of Muslims and Arabs in the United States. Noah Pickus, the co-leader, is the director of the Kennan Center on Ethics at Duke University, where he's the Natalie O. Cohane director. And he also is an immigration scholar, the author of True Faith and Allegiance, Immigration and American Civic Nationalism, Becoming American, America Becoming, and Immigration and Citizenship in the 21st Century. Our respondents, Juan Rangel is the executive director of United Neighborhood Organizations of Chicago and directs a series of charter schools with a predominantly Hispanic student population. Jake Vigdor is a professor of public policy at Duke University and the author of, you can find these outside on the materials table, a series of excellent studies, I think, done for the Manhattan Institute, called Measuring Immigrant Assimilation in the United States. And finally, our own Steve Malanga, contributing editor to City Journal, where he has written extensively on immigration. So beginning with Noah Pickus.
Thank you, Howard, and good evening to everybody. Howard talked about immigration being a topic of great emotional intensity in any country, but certainly here. But it's also one of tremendous technical complexity. And the combination of the two makes it awfully difficult to wade through, because you're either back in the arcana of various kinds of visa statuses, or you're looking at data on crime and economic effect, which is hard to parse, or you're dealing with the emotional and cultural dimension and swinging back and forth amongst all those. And what seems to happen if you look at, we have a report here. So does every other group out there have a report, and there have been 5 or 6 just in the last year or two. And we launched ours in part because when we looked at the way other groups had put together their approaches, they tended to be like-minded. That is to say, they gathered people together who agreed on most of the big things and disagreed on some of the narrow specifics that needed to be hammered out. And we thought that, while valuable in a variety of ways, was also quite limited, because most of the debate here really needs to be, both politically and normatively, needs to include a much wider range of views, those who are, so to speak, pro-immigration and those who are pro-reduced immigration. Now, we didn't gather the full range of views, but we did get quite a lot of difference. Howard spoke about that. We had folks who believed that the most important views that needed to be addressed in immigration were reestablishing the rule of law. And we had those who believed that the most important ideas were to establish that we have a reality of immigration, particularly illegal immigration, that our laws need to come into conjunction with, have to reflect, that the reality, that the demand for immigration is what matters as opposed to the laws. We had differences over family-based immigration, skills-based immigration. And then we had the differences where you have policy entrepreneurs and think tank folks and academics and government officials and the whole range. And you can imagine the difficulties of talking across all these kinds of differences. And so it took us quite a while to work through this. But I do want to say to you that there are 3 differences about what we tried to do before getting to some of the specifics that I think are worth paying attention to when you look not only at our work, but at any other proposals that are out there. First, of course, is that there is a range of views that is adequately represented. It can't simply be those who want more immigration, even if they come from different political perspectives, or vice versa. But you also have to look at the proposals so it doesn't seem like it's all good things go together. if you look at many other proposals and a lot of legislation, you will often find a kind of, well, we want enforcement, and we want legalization, and we want family-based immigration, and we want skills-based immigration, and we want assimilation, and we want integration. We want all these things, and they're sort of laid out next to each other. And nobody wants to say, but these things are often in conflict with each other. And until you actually address those conflicts, and the people in the room or the legislators feel some pain, then we're not actually going to get anywhere on this. And so we believe that we, within some parameters, got people to focus on making tough choices and trade-offs. Nobody in our group thinks this is the ideal policy, but they think it's a workable, doable, and defensible position. So if the first dimension is that you need a range of views, and the second is that you have to have trade-offs and tough choices that are apparent, that you can actually see in the proposals, you also have to take one more step, it seems to us, and that is to establish specific ways in which the different principles and policies at play are linked together. Because right now we have such a dearth of trust in this country on so many issues, perhaps on no issue more than immigration, that being able to get people who want a legalization program or an enforcement program to actually agree on anything is going to require confidence-building measures. It's going to require ways in which there are incentives for each side to move a little closer to the other. And that's what we've tried to do to build into all of these kinds of proposals. So with those in mind, as broad strategies, if you will, differences, we think, at the highest level from other proposals, let me sketch briefly what we've said, talk briefly about two of them, and then turn it over to Peter. We focused on the first idea that I mentioned, which is how do you connect a respect for the rule of law with the reality of ongoing illegal immigration? How do you focus on assimilation, a commitment to identity, to values, to becoming an American, and to integration, to social and economic and educational advancement? We focused on maintaining our commitment to family-based immigration, but tilting towards skills. And we focused on setting up a plan for how you could have a flexible and coherent system going forward to manage future flows on the grounds that whatever you fix now, if you had no plan for the future, we would simply be back in the same situation again in the near future. Let me talk briefly about those first two, the question of illegal immigration and the question of assimilation. The enforcement legalization debate that we have seen in this country now for some time has become almost a parody, right? Those who believe that we need to have enforcement first say, quite rightly in my own view, that if we don't have enforcement, if we simply have legalization, aren't we simply going to keep doing this over and over and over again? And those who favor legalization say, if we wait until enforcement is done, there's an enormous human cost, and we have a legacy that we're responsible for that's attracted people to work here and we have obligations to. And the result here is that it's always who's going to go first, right? This is the specific conversation with Senator Kyle right now and President Obama. And all we tried to do, and I can't stress enough, this is not rocket science, but it's rarely put together, is we tried to say that borders matter, but what really matters for both for legalization and for enforcement is the workplace. It's where the draw is. It's why immigrants, illegal in particular, come here. And that what we need to do is we have a capability with technology, with an E-Verify system, with secure IDs, is all possibilities now that 20 years ago we didn't have. We have an ability to actually do enforcement at the workplace if we wanted to. But getting to wanting to do that is very difficult. There are a lot of obstacles to making it happen. And we simply laid out a set of steps. I won't go into the particulars, they're in the report, by which you could simultaneously launch both an enforcement at the workplace focus and the infrastructure for legalization, and then through certification processes run by an agency like the GAO, ensure that each step along the way was met and we were actually getting enforcement at the workplace as legalization was coming into place. That's the linkage. Those were the incentives. That was the confidence building measures that we sought to put together. Now, on assimilation and integration, and here I'm using both terms on purpose, because if you think about the question of what do we do with immigrants who are here, not simply illegal, but legal as well, core to our debates have been these questions of, well, what will they become? What does it mean to become an American? And will they get ahead economically and educationally and socially? And the problem that we have in this country is that our approach to making citizens, to making Americans, is makeshift, and it's divided. It's divided because on the one hand you have those who like to use the word assimilation, who want immigrants to commit to American values and identity and to be loyal to the nation, and those who talk about integration, right, which is the code word for social and economic and educational advancement. And the point here is fairly simple. Both those matter. Both those are important. But if you ask somebody who uses either of those terms, they will bristle at the other one, and they will bristle at the policies that undergird that. And what we tried to say was, you need both of these. There's a variety of policies that they can be combined in. You can emphasize learning English and becoming a citizen, while also making sure we provide English classes. You can emphasize high expectations in our schools for the children of immigrants, and at the same time emphasize early intervention when it's needed. Again, I don't think these ideas are the most complicated notions in the world, but they're rarely put together in a way that would actually get people to agree that both aspects are necessary. And that brought us to our last point, which after some struggle, we agreed that we're not going to make any progress in assimilation and integration at the federal, state, or local level, in government agencies and in civil society, unless there is some way of better coordinating and driving and having a bully pulpit for this. And so we proposed an Office of New Americans that would be in the executive office and would have that precise role. Those are some of the proposals on enforcement and legalization and on the assimilation and integration of immigrants. And I'll ask my colleague Peter Skerry to talk about the other proposals we've made. Thanks.
Thanks, Noah. Thanks to all of you for coming this evening and the fellow participants. And I want to thank especially the Manhattan Institute for hosting this event, and especially Howard Husock for his loyal support to our effort for many, many months now. A different way of putting what Noah just suggested to you is that our effort with the Immigration Policy Roundtable, as we saw it, was really trying to face up to the tough choices of immigration policy that are so easily evaded in the heated context in which this debate has proceeded. And we did this in several different ways. At least we tried to face up to the difficult choices in several different ways. Most especially, we sought to face up to the difficulty of establishing a specific number of legal permanent resident immigrants to the United States each year. That's not something that many of the other blue ribbon panels have done directly. That whether we're talking about, for example, the Migration Policy Institute's fine report, but it's something they did not choose to do. Nor, I regret to say, has Senator Schumer and his colleagues in their recent proposal addressed this specific item. It's not easy to do, and particularly for people in Congress, we understand, but it's something our group sought to do. And what we fastened on, perhaps somewhat opportunistically, but what we fastened on is the existing number of legal permanent residents in the United States each year, 1.1 million per year. That's the current figure, and that's what we propose that we ought to remain with. But within this overall level, as Noah suggested, we also argued for a tilt toward more skilled immigration, which of course is what many participants in the debate today are also arguing for. But usually, almost always, this is a question of addition. It's more skilled immigrants on top of existing levels of immigration, especially existing levels of family-sponsored immigration. Again, no mystery there. That's the way the politics runs. It's always easier to add than to subtract. But what we at the Immigration Policy Roundtable chose to do was to advocate for more skilled immigration that we would pay for, if you will, by fewer family-sponsored immigrants. In effect, we argued that there should be, in addition to the 180,000 legal skilled immigrants that arrive here every year, we should increase that number by 150,000 for a total of 330,000 skilled immigrants annually, and that should be paid for by eliminating other levels of immigration, other categories, specifically the diversity program, which is basically a lottery system that's been in place since the 1990s. And we also argued that we should limit family-sponsored immigration to the family members, the immediate family members of citizens and legal permanent residents. That's a particularly difficult bite to take, but we argued that was the way to go, and that's how we could pay for our increase of 150,000 of skilled immigrants annually. Another tough choice that we think we faced up to was the backlog of 5 million family members of citizens and legal permanent residents who have been waiting to apply for visas, many for up to 20 years now. Some of them are here and some of them are overseas. This is a really tough one. What we decided to do, though, was that we had to, in effect, say no to most of these 5 million individuals who don't have visas yet, we emphasize. They are been told that they have valid claims to make an application for visas. But we also argued that we should admit some of them, those who are immediate family members of legal permanent residents. The immediate family members of citizens can already come in. But we would also allow the immediate family members of legal permanent residents. That would amount to some 600,000 individuals that we would bring in over a period of 6 years or so. Several million more, unfortunately, we would refund their fees and simply have to draw the line there. Again, we think not an easy choice, but one that was important to make. Now, we stuck with this figure of 1.1 million legal permanent residents annually out of a collective political judgment, not simply out of any notion of social science findings, although there were social scientists among us, but that simply that the American public would not tolerate an overall increase in legal permanent residents coming here annually, especially now, and especially in light of the problem we have with 12 million or so illegal immigrants who continue to live amongst us. We address this by arguing, as other efforts have, for a program of legalization. Our specifics were that those who, among this group of illegals who have been here for 5 or more years, should be eligible for a program of legalization, the details of which we could talk about later if that interests you. That sums up to about 8.5 million individuals who would be eligible. Nothing terribly new there, frankly. But what's really innovative, and we think realistic, is the confidence-building measures that Noah alluded to earlier. that would link the interests of advocates who want immediate legalization efforts, and at the same time link those efforts to the concerns of restrictionists and those who are preoccupied with enforcing our borders, whether at the interior or at the exterior of the country, and to try to join their interests together in moving forward with a program that meets both their needs. And as Noah described, that's what we sought to do, and that's what our proposal added to the mix that we don't think has been really done before. Okay. Now, what we then turn to, and what is an important piece of our overall effort, is the Standing Commission on Immigration, as we put it, which we proposed in the Immigration Policy Roundtable final report. Now, this is a bipartisan, presidentially appointed and confirmed by the Senate body. We had suggested that the individuals involved should have 7-year terms of a staggered nature. The idea being that this would be something that individuals of stature would be interested in committing their time to, so structured. The details could be haggled about. But what we were particularly concerned about was the powers and responsibilities of this commission and how we conceived of it. The real power and responsibility of this body would be to report to Congress every 2 years on visa categories and ceilings. And that Congress, in turn, would be required to either adopt, amend, or replace those specific proposals put forward by the Commission, and they'd have to do so within some specified period. As we conceive of it, this Commission would have limited powers, but a broad purview. The specifics would be what I just suggested, this biennial report addressing specific visa levels and categories. But we don't conceive of this commission, and this is where our conception differs from other such proposals, for example, former Labor Secretary Ray Marshall's proposal, or indeed Senator Schumer's recent proposal for a commission. They both conceive of this as a narrow kind of technical commission focused on labor market needs. Well, we clearly think labor market needs are important, but as Noah suggested with regard to assimilation issues, we also are very mindful of the broader issues beyond the labor market that immigration raises. So that this commission would have a staff of full-time professional social scientists, sociologists, demographers, political scientists, who would examine and produce reports and studies looking at all aspects of immigration. But despite the way that may sound, we don't conceive of this as a commission that would be providing some sort of technocratic fix. And above all, we did not think of this as an effort to end run the political process. Our commission, in our conceptualization, is an effort rather to shift immigration policy making to a more deliberative and less charged forum. Its biennial report would encourage, we think, all of us to look at immigration policy more holistically and more rationally. Right now, immigration policy proceeds or transpires really at two different levels. The first, and the one that we're most familiar with these days, is the media-driven controversies over illegal immigration and other hot-button emotional topics pertaining to immigration. But the result here is largely, as we've seen, is stasis. The basic contours and the basic parameters of policy don't change but once a generation, if that. But meanwhile, off camera, as it were, there are myriad visa programs, mostly for skilled immigrants and mostly on a temporary basis, that get created and are tinkered with in Congress all the time. There are 25 such visa categories right now, each with their own constituency and each with their own political dynamics. And as I suggest, with a few exceptions like the debate over H-1B visas, which is an example of this kind of visa program, it's gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. But most of the 24 other such categories don't get much attention, not much attention at all. And what we're suggesting by means of our commission is that the kinds of politics that transpires for these specific kinds of programs, really clientelist politics, that's quiet horse trading in Congress between specific constituencies and those who respond to their interest in Congress, all legitimate aspects of our democratic process, to be sure. But the problem is that there's no one who's taking stock of the larger picture, no one who's addressing the overall parameters of our immigration policy. And hence we have the game and the process of continual addition that we see with regard to our immigration policy. And we think, in the light of that kind of political dynamic, that this standing commission on immigration that our Immigration Policy Roundtable has proposed will give the opportunity to all of us to think about immigration policy in more holistic terms, and to do it in a form, we think, that's less charged and will be more responsible to the overall picture of our immigration policy. And with that, I'll turn it over to Howard and my panelists, fellow panelists.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do this conversation style. And so you heard the gist of the proposal and the key elements. An electronic verification at the workplace system so that if illegal immigrants come, they can't work. That's the choke point in this proposal. The trade-off, there's going to be a path to citizenship, but even that path will include a 5-year waiting time, got to learn English, got to know something about the history of the country through the citizenship test. Right? So these are really sharp trade-offs and a big shift from family unification, which means not just your mother and your father, it means your uncle and your aunt in Oaxaca can come. That's the system we have right now. And they're talking about, no, only your immediate family, and we're going to replace that long waiting list with skilled immigrants, right, and we're going to cap the whole kit and caboodle at the same time. Okay, I'm going to go this way. Steve Malanga of our own City Journal has written strongly about the need to shift toward a skills-based system. In fact, he wrote in the City Journal, "Will America make a historic shift to an immigration policy based on economic merit?" That's the phrase he used. I have to say, Bill McGurd in the Wall Street Journal channeled you this morning. I don't know if you saw his column, but he said really exactly the same thing. If you can be pro-immigration, you've got to be for this. Does this kind of a shift, keeping a cap on the total amount of immigration, but shifting the mix, convince you that we're beyond the road toward that historic shift?
Well, let me say what actually convinces me, or what actually attracts me the most, is not the individual policy decisions or the compromises. There have been significant compromises before. I think the Jordan Commission, which was a bipartisan commission, people on that commission
crafted 1991, right?
In the early, it began then, didn't deliver its report till much later. But there was a group, bipartisan, which when they came to sort of their conclusions, you had people all over the political spectrum willing to stand up and say, including Barbara Jordan, it's got to be different from what I believed. And they produced a mountain of academic, material to back up. It was initially accepted, then fizzled. One of the sort of advantages I have is that I don't just write for a journal, but much more popular stuff. And when the McCain-Kennedy bill first came out, I wrote a column that said simply, well, this is a remarkable compromise. Ted Kennedy willing to shift to, more economic based. John McCain willing, to endorse amnesty. I said, I don't think the final bill is going to look like this, but the fact that people are talking to this degree is significant. Well, here's what I got back in great detail. You don't understand. It's not about the policies. We've been betrayed over and over and over again. We were betrayed in '86. The policies have never been followed through. The word that was used over and over again was some form of betrayal.
From readers, you mean?
From readers. Well, this is the interactive age. People just sit there and they click, and they either give you a comment or they send your email is posted at the bottom of, take your pick. And so you can read them and you get it right back. I heard this over and over and over again. Now, that was in 2007. What has happened to government trust since then? It's plummeted. And it's not just about immigration anymore. You write about solving the budget deficit. People say to you, you can't advocate tax increases. They won't use it for that. You can't advocate cutting entitlements. They won't use the surplus for that. There is a tremendous deficit of trust in this country. And I really believe that the most important argument, the most important point of view right now is to say we're going to craft proposals that you can have confidence in because we've thought of them in that way. I'm not sure that the politicians who are going to lead this fight understand that. If they understood it, there wouldn't be so much mistrust in government in the first place. But I think that you have to lead with that. And I think it's important that you saw that such a long time ago.
Lead with something that can definitely happen.
Well, and that people that lead by saying we don't just have a bunch of ideas, but we have policies that we thought about your mistrust of government, and here is the way we're framing this so that you can have confidence in this. I think that has to be...
If I might, Peter, Noah was the one who used the word trust.
Trust,
and so I want to get you guys on that together.
Right. Well, if I understand what you're saying, right, Steve, that this is... that what you like about our report is it's not any this specific or that specific. It is that we tried to take the lack of trust seriously, and we tried to identify mechanisms that you could build confidence along the way. Now, whether they will work, how they will work, there's a lot to be dealt with there. But that addressing that problem is as important, if not more, than the particular range of proposals that we had out there.
I would say especially at least as important. And it has to be something that one leads with, if you will, in this discussion.
And so the workplace enforcement, if people actually see it starting to happen, if they go to the workplace and they have to show a biometric card, and suddenly there's a sense that, whoa, life in the United States is different now. Would that get you there?
Right. I think that's... Now remember, of course, there's been a workplace enforcement project.
Since 1986.
Exactly. And so there, again, the mechanism has to be, we're going to do it this time. Here's how we're going to do it, and here's when it starts. But that's, I think, again, we're getting into specifics that I don't think are as germane as just the notion that you have to sort of lead with this idea that we know you don't trust us, but here's how we're going to try to convince you.
Yes, Peter.
There's another piece of this I would like to just grab onto for a second. I agree with what's been said, but I think what implicitly our report and its focus on a fixed number, the fixed level right now, speaks to is that the lack of trust that the American people have in our immigration system is really much bigger than the illegal immigration issue itself. I think that's an unfortunate sort of fixation.
That's the way people talk about it.
That's the way people talk about it. I think it's a surrogate for anxieties and misgivings about the total number and type of immigrants that are coming into the country, period. And I think what our focus on that number does, some of us, I think, thought this way explicitly, some of us didn't, but we did come to this single number, is that it speaks to the legal as well as illegal side. And one way of our responding to that lack of trust in the American public is to say, we're going to stick with this figure because we take your anxieties seriously.
Assimilation has come up, and you have an Office of New Americans. Jake Vigdor has written a great new book about New Americans. He did 2 indexes of assimilation for us at the Manhattan Institute. The big shift here is toward skilled-based immigration. Is that going to help with the assimilation issue, in your opinion, Jake?
Well, there's a couple ways to think about it. I mean, first of all, the notion that of writing assimilation into the proposal, I think, is a great idea. I think that immigration policy doesn't stop when someone crosses the border. Immigration policy should be about how do we encourage people to make their way in society so that they become productive members of society and that their children become productive members of society. By addressing illegal immigration, or undocumented, whatever you want to call it, that's an obstacle to assimilation, because when you're here without authorization, there are certain steps towards fitting into the country that you can't take or you're not willing to take because you're concerned you're going to be deported tomorrow. The shift towards skill basis, there's an interesting fact that not everybody might know here. Shifting towards, say, college-educated immigrants. Now, it's true that the college-educated immigrants, they're going to be more likely to speak English. So in that sense, they'll fit in. But one thing that comes out very clearly in the reports that I've done for the Manhattan Institute is that assimilation is not just one thing. There are different dimensions of it. And one dimension that I think matters quite a bit is the extent to which new immigrants conceive of themselves as Americans. And the concern with a lot of highly skilled immigrants is that if you look at the countries with the lowest rates of naturalization, they also tend to be the countries with the highest skilled immigrants. We have a lot of immigrants who come to the United States from Europe, from the more developed countries in Asia, from various parts of the world. They're very well educated. They come here to work on Wall Street. They come here to work in Silicon Valley. Do they think of themselves as Americans? Not necessarily. Do they think of their children as people who are going to grow up as Americans? Not necessarily. They might stay here until their multinational bank or multinational software firm transfers them to another country. If you look at the countries that have the highest rates of naturalization, they are almost exclusively very poor countries, countries with very, very poor education systems. So I'm an economist by training, so I love to talk about trade-offs. So there is potentially a trade-off between crafting an immigration policy that values skills and crafting an immigration policy that values assimilation.
So what are the countries with, because everybody wants to know, with the highest levels of naturalization?
If you, I don't know if we've brought up the diversity visas tonight yet or not, but basically there's a set of countries that don't send very many migrants to the United States overall, and people who qualify with, along a certain number of dimensions from those countries can enter a lottery every year, a lottery in which they give out between 50 and 100,000 visas. About 6 million people apply for the lottery every year. And most of the people who apply for this lottery come from countries in sub-Saharan Africa, countries in Southeast Asia, countries that have traditionally not sent very many immigrants to the United States, countries that are poor. And immigrants from these nations naturalize at very high rates. They place a very high value on living in the United States permanently. The typical high-skilled immigrant, some of them, it's not always appropriate to generalize, of course, but within that group of high-skilled immigrants, you are going to get a large number of people who look at the United States as a place to make some money for a few years and then move on.
Interesting. Speaking of assimilation and Americanization, Juan Rangel is a man who does not hesitate to use that term. He oversees a string of charter schools in the southwest side of Chicago. For some of you who were at our Social Entrepreneurship Award dinner in the fall, we gave him that award because of his efforts to lead a citizenship drive, naturalization drive. Since 1990, he has encouraged more than 90,000 Mexican Americans in the southwest side of Chicago to naturalize and become Americans, including a mass swearing-in ceremony at Soldier Field where you had how many?
11,000.
11,000 on one time. And he does it every day. He just got back from doing it on Flag Day in the southwest side of Chicago. So, Juan, we talked about the range, and Noah and Peter did, about the lack of trust and the range of views. Today, the Hispanic caucus of the Congress was meeting with President Obama. Some people think he's not really going to push forward with it, but he needs to just tell them that he is. What's your sense, as somebody who is living and working in one of the biggest Mexican American communities in the United States every day, how would it accept the idea of a workplace verification and a long waiting period no instant amnesty, at least a 5-year waiting period. Would that be acceptable? Is this really the makings of a political compromise?
I would say that unfortunately not. And I would say that in the sense that, I'd like to differentiate between what we call our community leaders and then the general population, the community. I think within community leadership, within activists, I think you're going to have a lot of pushback and a lot of that. Not because this proposal, which I'm very supportive of, and I think that one of the areas that I pushed back hard on was using the word assimilation, because I think even within the immigration roundtable, there was a lot of debate around whether we should use the word assimilation. I think that's an important word, and it's an important distinction to make as we're looking at any kind of immigration reform.
You like it?
I like it. I think it's a must. I think we need to have that. And I think what I like about the proposal is that there is an understanding that it's a give and take, that there is a trade-off, as Noah had put it. I don't know that a lot of the activist leadership in the Hispanic community understand that it's not a take. You don't get everything. That there have to be trade-offs in this proposal. And I'm cynical enough to think that perhaps they're not really interested in immigration reform, because any kind of real immigration reform is going to have those kinds of trade-offs. So I don't think you're going to get the support from the activist community. On the flip side, I think that people in our community are very pragmatic in their thinking, and I think that it's some of the things that were being proposed in terms of limiting family unification as to what does that mean beyond the nuclear family, and not allowing the family to go beyond the nuclear family, e-verify and some of those things. I think a lot of those things will be received very well by average people in the neighborhood, because in a very pragmatic way, I think they're going to think, well, I've got mine. And I think the vast majority of those individuals would qualify under this proposal. Not everybody, but the vast majority. And I think people are understanding of that, so that as long as I'm able to get my piece of the pie, then we should look at curbing further immigration. And we sometimes joke about that, but I think that's just a reality, is that people will see large numbers of people coming over, and people tend to forget how they got here, but they've got theirs. And I think there tends to be a disconnect between leadership in our community and then just average folks in our neighborhoods. I think the pushback is going to be very hard, and I think that it requires leadership, real leadership in neighborhoods, to take up the challenge and say, this is something that's real, has the potential for passing in Congress, and we need to give cover to our Congress folks as well, if we're serious about having some kind of immigration reform. Anything short of that, then it's just a lot of rhetoric, and I think a lot of times the fringe elements on both sides, because I think there are fringe elements on both sides, they really have no interest in seeing a comprehensive immigration reform pass, tend to be the beneficiaries of no action.
Because they continue to be employed on talk shows.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we have a distinguished audience. You are a distinguished audience, and there are many of you who have very well-informed views on immigration. I welcome your question. Michael Myers, you're one of them. Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. Wait for the mic. Yeah, the usual rules apply. Wait for the microphone, and if you don't mind identifying yourself, that'd be great.
I'm Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. To cap legal, I don't get the cap on the legal immigration if you don't do anything about the illegal immigration. This is not just a land of equal opportunity. This is freedom land. This is Disneyland. People come to the United States for their own reasons, not just economic reasons. And as Miguel said, once you're here, you stay here. So my point is, and how do you secure the border? How do you regulate? How do you monitor? How do you enforce legal immigration if you're not enforcing the border, if you're not securing the border? And I'm talking about the border meaning air, land, and sea, and not just the Mexican border. If you don't build a wall, if you don't shoot to kill if somebody comes over, if you don't take people who have come over illegally and put them out and exclude them, how do you enforce legal immigration? And so I just don't get it, and I haven't heard any answer to that. Now, with respect to the other problems, I won't take up the time.
Hang on, Mike. Let's get that's a fairly pointed question.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what it is you're not getting, because we see our endeavor as addressing both legal and illegal immigration. Our enforcement effort is focused on the workplace. That's true. If you're suggesting that the workplace isn't the kind of critical fulcrum, it's not the only fulcrum, that's for sure. But efforts at the border, we don't disagree with. We generally support it. But let's face it, focusing simply on the border, while difficult enough, is the relatively easy way out for many politicians right now. That's where there's relatively less resistance in the American body politic, because building things on the border, again, not without controversy, but it's a whole lot easier to do that there than it is to enforce our laws at the workplace, where you impinge upon the interest of employers. We think that is the tougher nut that deserves emphasis right now. People come here to work, by and large. They stay here for other reasons. I guess we disagree. I'm not sure what.
Well, you admitted that people just don't come here.
Hang on. Let's wait for the microphone, because we are recording tonight.
Yeah, just a follow-up on that, because. First of all, I don't know if you don't understand the underground economy. I know personally lots of illegal, undocumented workers, so-called workers. They don't have a Social Security card. They don't need a Social Security card. They have an underground economy. And there's also people who work in households with rich people who don't report them, and they will not report them, will not enforce them, will not call on them. We live in a city where the mayor doesn't believe in enforcing the federal laws. So I just don't get it. So how are you going to convince?
You know what? There are a lot of people. I think he thinks it's going to work if you do it at the workplace. You don't. That's what I get out of that.
And we have to start. We have to start somewhere. And our effort is to start where it's feasible to start. We're not unmindful of the rest, but we have to start somewhere. And down your road leads paralysis, because you can't do everything at once.
All right. Peter Schuck from Yale is somebody who has written for decades about immigration in America.
Thank you for reminding me how old I am. Precisely because of some of the conditions that you emphasized, the lack of trust, the gridlock in Washington, the inability of coalitions to come together over federal legislation, the action necessarily shifts to the states. And of course, we're observing this in Arizona and some of the copycat jurisdictions as well. And so I'm a little surprised that your report, unless I'm mistaken, does not discuss what I call immigration federalism and the circumstances under which state laws that seek to fill the enforcement vacuum, often clumsily and in ways that we might not agree with, should be sustained by the courts. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us what the nature of your discussions on immigration federalism was.
Well,
is that a way of saying, do they support the Arizona law, and would they support Attorney General Holder or would they support him in challenging it?
No, I'm asking for more general principles.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me just talk about process for a moment. In part because this was pre-Arizona, although, as you more than anyone else knows, there was lots of other state laws that have come and gone and local that have dealt with this. And I think that, so we largely didn't discuss that, partly as a matter of time, over the course of the meetings, but also because the level of agreement, there wasn't going to be any agreement there in this group on those issues. There was agreement, I think, that those were not the best ways to deal with these issues, and that if we didn't have something dealt with at a federal level, we would be dealing with those one by one in a whole series of different ways. But that isn't to say that there were judgments drawn on the specifics of any of the laws that you might want to mention at the time. So an oversight in one sense, but also driven by the reality of we had to take some things off the table if we were going to actually find some things we could agree on.
If I could take the chair's prerogative, this is called a cold call when you teach, but Phil Cassinetz has written about second generation, of the City University of New York Graduate School, has written about second generation immigrants in New York and takes, I think, a fairly sanguine view about the process of assimilation. I wonder if you would care to comment or ask a question.
Well, that is a cold call.
That is a cold call.
Well, actually, I had two questions that were in my mind, and I'm not sure that they may be somewhat unfair because I suspect in at least one case it's an issue that's come up after a lot of your discussions. But at least my view is that when we deal with this whole question of assimilation, which is not a term that I would shy away from either, in fact, when you talk about people who are born here, the second generation, when you talk about over long periods of time, the situation is not nearly as dire as it's often depicted. That assimilation is not just one thing. It's as Jake pointed out, it's a subtotal of lots of tiny little decisions. You know, people often say, "We will not assimilate," and then they do things that virtually guarantee that their children will. Right. And I think that was probably true in earlier immigration periods as well, and it's true here. So I think in terms of that, it's not as big a problem as it's often made out to be. One issue that has come up recently, both with some legislative proposals and with a variety of talking heads debating it, is the whole question of birthright citizenship, which again gets back to something Peter and other people have dealt with. And I was wondering if the Commission had taken a position on that. You know, the whole question of, you know, does part of the, because one of the things that I think our study found was that permanently blocking people from being able to be citizens. In this case, we were thinking about people who would come here as small children and had in fact lived their whole lives here, but were excluded from citizenship, really was probably the biggest threat to assimilation in the future, was the fact that in many cases we're not permitting that. One of the reasons that that's not been a huge problem so far is because the U.S. has had the long commitment, for better or for worse, for birthright citizenship. And I was wondering if the Commission, your Commission, would see that as something worth defending or something that has to be reconsidered.
And so birthright citizenship is even if a child is born of illegal parents but born on American soil, that child is an American citizen, right?
Which has been pretty much a matter of settled law in the United States, even if that wasn't the intent of the amendment that they created.
Right. And by the way, I invite anybody on the panel to jump in on this, not just Noah and Peter on any of the questions, but I don't know which of you wants to lead off.
Well, briefly, I think first on assimilation, I think our discussions were, I think everyone recognized it is multidimensional, and then the real question was, some thought there were a lot of things to be worried about, and some thought there was virtually nothing to be worried about, and it was captured in the fact that if you look at English acquisition over generations, as you know, in many cases it's very good. On the other hand, if you look at the Hispanic dropout rate, if you look at what Juan confronts every day, it's enormous. The figure 50%?
For some schools, 54%.
54%. And what we were trying to do is not get hung up too much on the is it never going to happen or is it going to happen automatically, because we thought the truth was somewhere closer in the middle. And what's clear is we don't do a very good job of ways we could improve it on both the dimensions that we talked about and Jake and others sketched out. We didn't talk about birthright citizenship. It didn't come up. I would actually guess that there would be fairly widespread agreement in this group that actually ending birthright citizenship would be a mistake for the reasons you articulate as well as others. though there might have been a few who would think otherwise. But it was not something that was raised as a central issue.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, and I don't have data on this, this is just my own experience working in this community. I think the premise on birthright citizenship is that people actually come here because they want their children to be born here, and that they're going to stay here forever and all that. I don't think that's the premise that people operate by. I think they come here looking to make a few bucks here and there, a few years, and we're going to go back to a much healthier lifestyle in whatever country. That doesn't happen, unfortunately. I think people end up staying here by default. On the question of assimilation, I do think that there is an assimilation. I think you'll have figures that show that Mexicans are probably the ones that assimilate the least in terms of English acquisition and all those things. I think part of the problem is that this country lacks the will to push assimilation on its newest immigrants. I think there's a tendency to coddle Hispanics in particular because we tend to be a minority, much different than a lot of other immigrant groups, and we're afraid to push assimilation, which has worked for every other immigrant group in this country, but somehow we're afraid to face that reality for this one.
Sure.
I could say a lot. I'll just try to say a little. That I think what Phil raises a very important point, that long-run viewpoints often get kind of trashed in political debates. But when we're talking about immigration policy, immigration is about admitting a person and admitting their descendants. And so if we take a long-run view, the characteristics of the person we're admitting might matter very little compared to the characteristics of the descendants. And I think that's an important perspective.
Yeah, okay. Larry Mead from New York University.
Larry Mead from NYU. I'm impressed by this report in the sense that you got agreement on a fairly extensive program of reform. I think that's difficult and it's to be admired, and I don't want to take off my hat to your achievement in that way. At the same time, I don't find it goes as far as I'd like. And in particular, the legalization proposals, it seems to me, are half-hearted. As I read the text, the E-Verify system would merely be developed and discussed, but it's not mandated. That in your report, you don't say it's going to be instituted.
No, absolutely.
It depends upon approval by GAO.
If the GAO doesn't certify that it's actually been reached a saturation point and that fraud has reached a minimum is below a minimum level, then the legalization process does not go forward.
Okay, well, I think that's a likely outcome. I think what you'll probably find is that there'll be a problem with that, and the legalization will be back to square one. And another basic judgment you're making is that employers are willing to be enforcers here. Now, it's true that employment verification is a frontier, but the contradictory interests of the employers, I think, militate against their playing this role. So I was disappointed not to see more about border security, because the attitudes of the immigrants are highly political. Whether they come here is a function of whether they're seen as welcome. And one thing border security projects is a strong resistance to illegal immigration. And people hear that, and therefore they are deterred from coming. So there's a political function here aside from the mere border security. You say almost nothing about border security. And it seems to me that is something that is a weakness in the report. And maybe you couldn't get agreement about that. Now, in the background here is the fact that the liberal side of the debate is unwilling really to give up illegal immigration. I think they see it as a safety valve in a way in which people can come from Mexico when they absolutely have to. They want there to be a way for everybody finally to come to America. I didn't see any proposal you made that would actually deny any specific individual the ability to come to America. Even the restrictions on family unification would be offset by the increases in legal immigration. You even say in the text that many of those denied under the family rules would now be able to come under the legal immigration rules.
Usually this is the time when I say, what's the question?
All right. I guess my question is...
We'll call that a sharp challenge and an implicit question, either.
Yeah. No, fair enough.
Well, Larry, I'm not sure... the point about our E-Verify proposal, we don't really disagree with what you just said. You misread the report. We're very clear, and we got real, almost unanimous agreement on this point within our group. that these two are linked, and the legalization doesn't go forward until there's e-verify on the ground. We were very mindful, spent a lot of time talking about all sorts of sources of pushback on this, and we were very clear that enforcement at the workplace is primary. That has to go first.
It only applies to new hires.
It applies to new hires in the first instance, but our intent is quite clear that this is a system that's going to apply across sectors for all hires. And unless those get verified step by step by some agency like GAO, then legalization won't proceed. So I refuse to disagree with you on that because we were there, okay? Now, with regard to the border, I guess I will have to disagree with you because the notion that the border enforcement sends out strong signals, well, on the one hand, clearly it sends out signals, but the notion that it deters people from coming here, I think is implausible and inaccurate on its face. We've done a lot at the border. We've invested billions of dollars in all sorts of manpower, and we haven't gotten very much for it. Now, I think that border enforcement is important. Don't misunderstand me. But the notion that that's where we ought to put, sort of primary emphasis, I think is just wrong. That is the path of relative least resistance in the immigration debate. Enforcement at the work site is really where we have to put our money, and that's what I think most of us on our panel agreed. And I think we just have a basic difference of opinion there.
All right, I'm going to take a couple really, really quick, short questions and short answers, and then I'm going to have a required question for everybody on the panel. Where do you see this debate going in the Congress? And we're going to wind up that way. This gentleman has been very patient. If you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone.
Thank you. I'm Aristide Zollberg at the New School, and I'm sympathizing with the report, but I just want to add my voice to the skeptics about the e-verify and working place enforcement, because for the reasons that have been mentioned, I just don't want to, since there's little time, I don't want to repeat all of them. But it's clear that it would require a degree of law enforcement that would really transform totally. I mean, I've lived under Nazi occupation and somehow managed to survive as a Jew by lying and having false papers. And I think it's much easier to do in the U.S. So it would require a degree of law enforcement that is totally incompatible with normal American administrative behavior.
The trust deficit sounds like it's still there, Noah. I invited Peter Brimelow, author of Alienation, to come, so I have to call on him.
He's right.
Thank you, Howard. I'm Peter Brimelow. I'm the editor of Vigdor.com, where we represent a fringe point of view that was not invited to participate at the round table, probably very wisely. I guess I'm an immigrant doing a dirty job that Americans won't do. My question is, particularly to Peter, how did you arrive at this number of 1.1 million legal immigrants a year in the teeth of this extraordinary unemployment situation, like 10, 11% unemployment, which is perfectly obvious that nobody, left or right, has any idea how to resolve? Why have any immigrants at all with this kind of unemployment?
What? Say that again.
Why have any immigrants at all with this kind of unemployment?
Yeah.
Well, like I said, Peter, it was a political judgment of the group, and it was some wanted to opt for a higher number now in the face of what you're talking about. A few of our members argued for somewhat less, but I make no bones about it. We had within the context of our group a political process and a political judgment call, and we settled for the existing level.
But is that your judgment about what would be... Nobody cares about the group now, right? We care about what will happen in the Congress. And so is that your sense that that is more politically acceptable? I think that's what Peter's question is, than cutting it down.
Well, which is more politically acceptable, Peter?
To stick with the flat figure.
No, that's not politically acceptable at all for most people in Congress. It's what's politically acceptable, which Peter has indicated earlier, is to simply add on in a variety of ways that some of which are explicit, most of which are implicit,
Right.
that you have to, there's a whole shadow system of another million immigrants who come on top of the 1.1 that Brimlow's referring to. And so the problem here, when we talk about lack of trust, is the extent to which, if you begin to look behind illegal immigration, you get legal immigration. When you get to legal immigration, you get the variety of people who are coming here, who Americans sense are in the communities, and there are these various benefits and struggles over, but they feel that they are not in control of these forces. And so the temptation is to try and grasp it at the border, which of course seems like the easiest thing to do, but turns out to be incredibly difficult to accomplish practically, enormously easy to say politically, but difficult to carry out, and require the kind of money and manpower that we've never been willing to put up with. So the E-Verify and all that, absolutely, Ari, that is enormously difficult. It's the only thing that is less difficult than pretending that we could actually solve this by doing it at the border. And so if we're going to focus on this, we have to focus on it in a way that is going to link with legalization, and that's the place to do it at the workplace. It's not that it's easy or likely, but I think it's more likely and a better idea.
I think that Peter Skerry was saying to you that that's as restrictionist as he thinks he can get away with. So,
no, but what the answer to Peter Brimelow is that what's politically acceptable today in Congress is pie in the sky. Demanding border enforcement as though that's going to solve the problem, or demanding legalization as though that's going to solve the problem, or increasing levels of skilled workers, which is as if that's going to solve the problem. Everybody's running off in their own direction with a phony solution to a phony problem. I think we focused on a much more realistic problem, albeit we came up with a number that Peter Brimelow doesn't like.
I'm going to call it off, and I'm going to go to my required summa here from everybody, which is, where's this going to go politically, in your opinion? Juan Rangel.
I think in the short term, it's not going to go very far. I think that in spite of the big push from the Hispanic immigrant community, it's very well documented. Hispanics don't vote in great numbers, so therefore that push won't have much of an effect. And I think on the flip side, I think that we have a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress that are trying to save their own positions of power with the upcoming elections, and then probably for the next presidential cycle as well. I don't see anything happening in the short term.
Jake Vigdor.
I'd agree that at 2010 I don't see anything happening. I think that the sort of environment where I would anticipate something being more likely to happen would be where you have one party in the White House and the other party controlling Congress. I think that in a situation like what we have now, there are too many incentives to not compromise because of short-term political considerations. We'll see. The latest projections I've seen on how things are going to end up in the 2010 elections suggest that we're not quite going to get to that sort of oppositional position by 2010. So it's going to be at least another couple of years, I think.
Steve Malanga.
Yeah. I hate to take the cynical view, but I find it difficult to imagine, particularly in the House, that people, where districts are, often, heavily of one dimension or another, that people are going to compromise out of the gate, that there seems to be more political gain from sticking to your particular position right now. So I think that, like too much in Congress right now, we're likely to see paralysis unless there's some kind of a crisis that prompts everybody for some reason to move. I don't understand.
Is Arizona not that crisis?
I don't think, from what I'm hearing, no, because all people are doing is hardening their individual positions. So I don't think so. So short term, I just don't, and I certainly don't see anybody pursuing the notion that we're going to do something that you can have confidence in. I don't see any politically even understanding that yet in Congress. If they understood that, there wouldn't be so much mistrust of Congress, as they said before.
No, and Peter, that's a tough analysis for you guys, because you...
That's why our plan is so good, right? If only everyone... No, I think that I think it's Peter Schuck's question. I think that, the next time around we're going to be back to state and local, and that's where a lot of the action is going to be. And it's not going to be good action. I mean, it will be driven by a variety of different impulses, some good, some not as good, but it will be these scorched earth kind of propositions, where you either vote up or down on one, are you for or against something, and it won't have any of the necessity of having to make a choice. And so we're going to be muddling through.
Peter Skerry, in a past life, was legislative aide to the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, so he knows something about politics in the Senate. Any hope, Peter?
Unfortunately, not in the near term. I mean, I think the kinds of reactions our proposals got here tonight are suggestive of the problems we're up against. I mean, I think, despite what I heard, I think we tried to face up to some difficult choices, and it's not perfect. But immigration is such a globalistic issue that reaches in so many different directions, and our political system today offers so many incentives for so many different interests to run in their own directions without, an effort to bring it together. That I don't see this happening real soon.
But when it does, they'll turn to the Immigration Roundtable's report, we know. Please join me in thanking our panel.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.